Assalamu alaikum dear viewers. Dear viewers, in today's video, I'll be discussing a very important topic, another in fact very important topic of international relations, and that topic is diplomacy. Diplomacy is the importance of diplomacy in international relations cannot be denied for the fact that the foreign policy is implemented through this diplomacy, and it is an arm of the foreign policy of a country, and the foreign policy of the country is made, as I have already discussed in some of my previous videos, that it is made to safeguard the national interest of a country. So that is why diplomacy is really important. Maybe we would cover this topic in more than one videos. It would depend on the level of explanation which I present over here in this video. So I would try to sum it up over here in one video, but if I could not, then it will be, you will receive a part 2 of this video as well, like the previous topic. Now, diplomacy stands accepted as the mainstay and the core process of international relations among the states or among the nations. So we cannot deny that diplomacy is not important. Therefore, special focus should be there on diplomacy by the states if they want to pursue successful foreign policy in international relations. Now we can also assess the pertinence of diplomacy by looking into the fact that whenever there is a new state, whenever a new state emerges on the global map, so usually these states are accepted by other states, and when they are accepted by other states of the international community, it means that they have got diplomatic relations with those states, because acceptance by the diplomatic community, by the international community, is a sign of diplomatic relations. So if, like, we have the example of the Taliban government in Afghanistan from 1996 till 2001. Sorry about this disturbance. So I was discussing that when the Taliban government was formulated in Afghanistan from 1996 till 2001, when it was there in Afghanistan, it was only accepted by 3 countries. Number 1, Pakistan. Pakistan accepted that government, and then Pakistan had diplomatic relations with the Taliban government. Number 2 was Saudi Arabia. It had diplomatic relations with the Taliban, and it had accepted the Taliban government in Afghanistan. And number 3 was, I guess, UAE. Yes, it was UAE. So these 3 countries had diplomatic relations with the Taliban government. So that is why it is important to accept a state, and whenever state A accepts state B, it means that these 2 states have got diplomatic relations with each other now. Okay, the next thing which we are going to discuss is about the meaning of diplomacy, or we will be discussing, we will be going through some of the definitions of diplomacy. So the diplomacy is the management of, now this is, definitions by different scholars, so they are very comprehensive in nature. That is why I will go through them word by word, so that you can get the importance of diplomacy and you can get the full understanding. You can develop a full understanding of this term which we call diplomacy. So diplomacy is the management of international relations by means of negotiations, the method by which these relations are adjusted and managed by ambassadors and envoys, the business or art of diplomats. Right? This is one definition. Then there is another view about diplomacy. It is another view about diplomacy, that is, diplomacy is the inevitable outcome of the coexistence of separate political entities, political units, or which we call state, with any degree of contact. Now this is a second view about diplomacy. What does diplomacy do? As I have already discussed, that it is there to promote your foreign policy, and your foreign policy is there to safeguard your national interests. So this is the core function of diplomacy, to safeguard the national interest of the parent state, not the host state, right? The host is that state in which the diplomat is posted, and the parent state is called, that is that state from which the diplomat is posted to the host state, right? I hope I have made my point clear. If not, you can ask me during the Q&A session for this video. Then there are very interesting views about diplomacy as well, and I find them really interesting, and I would like you to ponder over that as well, because we cannot ignore views which we think that we do not agree with it, but still we will have to go through the views even if we do not agree with that. So the question is that what is diplomacy? Now, it is the art of telling lies on behalf of the nation, or as an instrument for employing deceit and duplicity in international relations. Deceit and duplicity in international relations, right? This is an instrument for that. Now, what are the views of Stalin, Joseph Stalin, about diplomacy? His views are very interesting about diplomacy, and I will go through some of his views by reading them. He says that a diplomat's words must have no relation to his actions. This is one view, like it should be complete lies. Then, and if he says if his words has any relations with his actions, then what kind of diplomacy that would be, right? So he says that he should tell lies all the time. A diplomat should do that. He should not be truthful. This is Joseph Stalin. Then again, he further says that good words are masked for concealment of bad deeds. So diplomats, they usually use these good words and very precise and very calculated words, but he says that they are designed for the concealment of bad deeds, and that is why they should use these good words. Otherwise, there is no need for the good words. And then again, he says that sincere diplomacy is no more possible than dry water. Very interesting. And wooden iron. Like, you cannot expect sincere diplomacy. If you say that there is a sincere diplomacy, it is equivalent like saying that there is a dry water somewhere on the planet, or there is a wooden iron available, like, completely opposite thing. An iron cannot be made of wood, and water cannot be dry. So likewise, diplomacy cannot be sincere. This is what he tries to imply over here. Then he says that, and this is very important, this is very interesting, this one, that when a diplomat says yes, he means perhaps. When he says perhaps, it means no. And when he says no, he is not a diplomat, right? I will repeat this one. When a diplomat says yes, he means perhaps. When he says perhaps, he means no. And when he says no, he is not a diplomat, right? This is Joseph Stalin. These things have been quite popular. These kind of definitions or interpretations of diplomacy, you will find them in a lot of places in various literatures on diplomacy, but they do not reflect the true nature of diplomacy, because diplomacy cannot always be termed as the art of deceit and concealment. It is the conduct or the art of negotiations or the conduct of foreign policy. So you are, it is an art of negotiations. You have your negotiator posted in another country, and now he will safeguard of the national interest of your country, and this diplomacy is an arm of your foreign policy, and it is not a requirement that the diplomat should always tell lies. All he needs to do is to justify the national interest of that country in the eyes of the administration of the host country. So then he will be able to, if he is able to impress upon them, then he will be able to do something good for the achievement of the national interest of his country. If he is somehow unable to do that, then he will not be able to do any good for his national interest. But it does not mean that he should always conceal, he should always deceive, he should always tell lies about whatever he is telling, and conceal his real aim and objective like a spy. So a diplomat is not a spy. You need to keep it in mind. Okay, now several definitions of the diplomacy. We will go through some of the definitions of diplomacy. We cannot go through all of the definitions, but some of the major definitions of diplomacy, I have compiled them over here. So we will just come, we will go through them, and then you will come to know about the real nature of diplomacy. It is the process of representation and negotiation by which states customarily deal with one another in times of peace. So in times of peace, when states deal with one another customarily, it is basically that process through which they deal with each other, which we call diplomacy, right? Then diplomacy, another definition is that diplomacy is the application of intelligence and tact to the conduct of official relations among governments or between governments of independent states. So this is again another definition. Then another definition is diplomacy is the art of forwarding one's interests in relations to other countries, and these interests are definitely not personal interests, they are national interests. So diplomacy is in its essence that art through which you promote or you carry forward your interest, the national interest. Another definition about diplomacy is that it is the management of international relations by means of negotiations, the method by which these relations are justified or the method by which these relations are adjusted and managed by ambassadors and envoys, the business or the art of the diplomat, right? So this is basically the business of the diplomats or the art of the diplomacy, that they try to manage these relations or the relations among states. They carry forward their national interest through negotiations. So they are not necessarily required to tell lies about it. They do at times, but not necessarily all the time. Then another definition of Morgenthau is that diplomacy is the promotion of national interest by peaceful means. Now you either promote your national interest through war, or you either promote it through peaceful means. So this diplomacy, Morgenthau says that diplomacy is the promotion of your national interest through peaceful means, and I like this one the most because it is precise, it is short, and it is comprehensive as well. Okay, if now we analyze all the above definitions of diplomacy which I have just presented in front of you, then there are, the nature of diplomacy emerges from these definitions, and then there are a few aspects of this nature of diplomacy which I'll be highlighting shortly. So number one, diplomacy is not immoral. It is not lies, deceit all the time. It is something which is justifiable and which is moral as well, right? It is not always based on propaganda. It is not always based on lies and deceit and etc., etc. Then diplomacy is a means of international relations. That is why it is necessary, and you cannot say that you cannot say that diplomacy is always deceit and concealment of facts and real goals, because then nobody will be believing on the diplomats stationed in their country. So that is why it is acceptable, and it is a means of international relations. It is a normal means. It consists of techniques and procedures for conducting of relations among states. So it is something which is quite normal. That was point number 2 derived from those definitions. Then diplomacy is machinery for action. You have your goal, that is the national interest, and that national interest would be achieved by communicating with different countries through official channels, and that is the official channel is the channel of diplomacy. So if a country is communicating with different countries through this official channel, so what happens that it becomes like a machine. This machinery or this diplomacy, this is in operation now, and it is at work to achieve those interests for you. This machinery is there to smoothen the relations between different countries, right? So that is why this is quite vital, and it is, again, I would reiterate that it is not that diplomacy is something bad, something sinister. We should not call it like that. Then diplomacy acts through settled procedures. The procedures of diplomacy in current age and time are quite settled now. Everybody know about the norms of diplomacy. It is being taught to the civil servants who are serving in the foreign ministries and foreign offices of different countries or state departments in the United States of America. So these procedures are taught to them, and these settled procedures are like, a network of foreign offices. We can see them. Then there are embassies across the globe. Then there are consulate and special missions are all over the world. So these are those settled procedures through which you carry forward your goals through diplomacy. But these are the machine. These are parts of this machine: the foreign office, the embassies, the consulates, the special missions, which are sent to different countries to achieve a particular purpose, to talk about a specific issue with that country, and then come back. So these are called the special missions. So all these things are part of those procedures which are now part of the modern diplomacy. Then bilateral as well as multilateral in form. Diplomacy is not only bilateral. It is not only that Pakistan has got good relations with China, and the embassy of China is in Pakistan, and the embassy of Pakistan is in China. Likewise, Pakistan has got relations with the United States. The embassy of the United States is in Pakistan, and the embassy of Pakistan is there in Washington DC. It is not only this form of relations which we call bilateral relations between two states. It is multilateral as well. How it is multilateral? You just think about the United Nations. It is a form of multilateral diplomacy. The envoys or the representatives of all the member states are stationed over there in New York, in the United Nations. And when they come together and they discuss an issue, this is the form of multilateral diplomacy. Then there are regional negotiations as well. You can think about this Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the European Union. So these are regional negotiations. They take place in different regions. They are not at global level, but they are at regional level. But still, they are called multilateral because there are more than two states involved in these negotiations and in these conferences, or in these seminars which you call, or in these sessions of these regional and international organizations. So that is why it is multilateral in nature as well. Another point is that, from the definitions, is that diplomacy handles all types of matters, right? How? Because there is not a single national interest. It is a multitude of interests. It might be economic interest, it might be cultural interest, it might be military interest, and you just think about it, it might be some kind of an interest related to the transfer of technology or related to technology. So all these interests of one state and another state. So diplomacy tries to take care of all these interests, and it has embraced all these aspects which I have just elaborated. Then if there is a breakdown, another thing is that, like as Morghetto says, that it is through peaceful means you achieve your interest through peaceful means. So what does it mean? That if the breakdown of diplomacy happens, like if two countries curtail or cut off their diplomatic relations with each other, it would lead to a crisis, because it will create a deficit of trust between the two countries, and it is always preceded or it is always followed by a war or a crisis whenever the relations between two countries are somehow when they go below the normal. So the first step which they take is they try to limit their diplomatic relations with each other, and you can take the example of Pakistan and India in this regard, that we have limited our diplomatic relations with each other, and India had a few days back, India had expelled two members of the diplomatic mission of Pakistan by terming them as persona non grata, those people who are not welcome. So unwanted people over there, and then they returned them to Pakistan, asked them to leave India in 24 hours. And just a day before yesterday, two diplomats of Indian High Commission in Islamabad were apprehended by the police in Islamabad because their vehicle hit some locals, some pedestrians. So they were apprehended, but later on they were released. But the main point is that this relation, if we see a breakdown of diplomatic relation, then we can easily assume that it would lead to a crisis between two countries, and at times it can even lead to a war. So that is why the maintenance of diplomatic relations between countries is really important, because they settle their disputes or their conflicts through negotiations, because they want to avoid war. Then so diplomacy operates not only in times of peace. Again, another point, it operates not only in times of peace, but it operates in times of war as well. Because if there is a war or if there is a conflict, so ultimately the conflict is brought to an end by negotiations, right? These negotiations might be bilateral, these negotiations might be multilateral, but this diplomacy is at work even in times of war. And a very good example of this is the peace talks between Taliban and the United States. On the one hand, there was a war going on between the Taliban and the United States in Afghanistan, but on the other hand, the United States, the envoys and the diplomats of the United States and the representatives of Taliban, they were meeting in Doha and in other countries as well, but they were trying to finalize the ifs and buts of the withdrawal of the United States of America, and they were trying to come together and develop a consensus on the power sharing formula between the two countries, between the Taliban and the United States of America. Pakistan was also involved in these talks. At a level, China was involved in these talks, but not at a later stage. It was earlier than this final round of talks. So on the back end, different countries were involved in these talks. So that is why diplomacy not only operates in times of peace, it operates in times of war as well. Then take the example of the First World War. It was brought to an end by different settlements, different treaties between the victorious and the defeated powers, and it is again an example of a diplomacy at work in times of war as well, right? I hope I have made my point clear over here. And at times of peace, I have been discussing all the functions of diplomacy before this one, and whatever I have been discussing, it was usually at peace. These things happen at times of peace, but at times of war, I have just cited some of the examples of diplomacy during war times, and that is to bring the war to an end. Then diplomacy works in an environment characterized by both conflict and cooperation. It is not always cooperation, it is a conflict as well. To a certain degree, cooperation is essential for the working of diplomacy. There is no denying the fact that cooperation should be there. But when there is no conflict, diplomacy becomes outdated. Because negotiations are usually done to come to a common ground, to find a settlement for something. So if there is no conflict, then we cannot say that diplomacy is required anymore, because there is no conflict. Everybody says, yes, I agree with you, yes, I agree with you. So if this kind of attitude is there and there is no conflictual issue between the two countries or between different countries, then there is no need for diplomacy. So that is why it is characterized by both cooperation and conflict. They go hand in hand, and then diplomacy will thrive. Diplomacy always, another point is that diplomacy always works for securing national interest of the nation it represents. So it is quite obvious it does do that. It is rather the prime goal of diplomacy, or the primary objective of diplomacy, to secure the national interest, all right, of the country which it represents. Like the Pakistani diplomat in the United States of America would definitely try to secure the national interest of Pakistan, and vice versa. So it would be like that. Then diplomacy is backed by national power. I have already discussed this issue of national power, and even over there I told you that national power is really important to effectively assert yourself, and for effective foreign policy and effective diplomacy. So it is there, it is backed by the national power, because if a country is powerful, the value of the words of the diplomat of that country would be more than the value of the words of a diplomat of a country which is less powerful. You need to keep it in mind, right? So it is the power of the state behind the words of the diplomat. That is why these words matter. If you minus the power of the state from behind that diplomat or diplomatic mission, then you will find that these would be merely words and nobody will heed, right? These words. Because this power or national power has the ability to give ultimatums. If a diplomat is saying that we give you ultimatum, this country should do this and that, because this is an ultimatum, by this time the country should do. So if the country which is giving ultimatum, if it is a weak state, so nobody will take serious those ultimatums. No country will take it. Then it should, if the country is powerful, the diplomats would promise rewards by the powerful country to the country to which he is negotiating, with which he is involved in negotiations, or to which he is posted, so that and only powerful countries can reward, weak countries cannot reward, and he can threaten these countries as well. One is the carrot, as I would explained in one of my previous videos, and the other is the stick. So this reward is that carrot, and the punishment, the threat of punishment, is the stick through which this diplomacy works. But how he will do this, why people would take him seriously, or why his words would be valued or taken serious, it would be taken serious only if the country is powerful. If the country is not powerful, nobody would take him seriously. No country would take him seriously, right? So the national power is there. If the national power is there, the national power is at play behind the diplomacy. So if the national power is there, then diplomacy would be more successful. Otherwise, we might not see the success of diplomacy if you minus the national power from diplomacy. Then how to test the success of diplomacy? It can only be tested that how far it has fulfilled its stated objective, like how far it has achieved something for its national interest. So it can only be tested in this regard. If diplomacy is unable to achieve the national interest or to achieve its goals, stated goals, then we would say that this is not a successful diplomacy. It is rather a failed diplomatic effort. It was a failed diplomatic effort, right? So this is again an important thing, and we can call it a litmus test of diplomacy, right? If something is achieved, then yes, diplomacy was successful. If something hasn't been achieved, then diplomacy was unsuccessful. So I think I have made my point clear. All these things which I have mentioned, it only tells us one thing, that diplomacy is really important for the conduct of international relations, or for the pursuance of your foreign policy. It is really important. Now, what are the objectives of diplomacy? The objectives of diplomacy can be divided into two categories. Number one is the political objectives, and number two is the non-political objectives. Political objectives of diplomacy are, they always, sorry for the disturbance. Political objectives of diplomacy is like they always work to secure the goal of the national interest as defined by the foreign policy. That is the political objective of diplomacy. And it always works for increasing the influence of the state over other states. It is another political objective of diplomacy, that you need to increase your influence over other states. And then through rational negotiation, it seeks to justify the objectives of the foreign policy of the nations, right? So negotiations are there, and it justifies the objectives of the foreign policy of negotiations. And when it justifies these objectives, it definitely is clear, it is out in the open, and this element of secrecy is no more there, an element of deceit and lies is no more there, because it is trying to justify that these are we know that this is an era of interdependence, and no country is self-sufficient. Every country is somehow dependent on another country. No country can live in isolation. So this dependency can be economic dependency, it can be dependency in shape of defense, and dependency in all other aspects as well. So diplomacy always seeks to promote the economic, commercial and cultural links of the nation with other nations. Diplomacy depends upon peaceful means, persuasive methods to promote all these interests which I have just listed in other countries. I hope this political and apolitical has been cleared, and if not, you can ask me during the question answer session for this lecture, and you can also post under this video in your comments, so then I'll try to elaborate it further. But I hope it is clear for the time being. Then what are the means of diplomacy? There are several means of diplomacy through which these interests or these objectives are achieved. Number one is the persuasion. Number two is compromise. You try to persuade, but if somebody resists to be persuaded, then what do you do? To be persuaded, then what do? You compromise on some of the issues, but still come to the common terms or come to the common ground with your opponent. And the threat of use of force is another means through which diplomacy is carried forward or conducted. Then there are several techniques and several other issues, several other means as well, but these are some of the core means which I have just listed. And all these things, you need to keep it in mind that you need to, the diplomat, that is now up to the common sense of the diplomat, that the diplomat is there and he is the best judge of the situation to decide what kind of means is to be used in that specific situation in order to resolve the situation. So that is up to the common sense of the diplomat. Now, what are main devices of diplomacy? So, number one main device of diplomacy is the persuasion. As I have already told you, that persuasion is number one means of diplomacy. Through persuasion, you persuade the host country, the administration in the host country, to consider your objectives as just objectives of your national interest, and then agree to some of the proposals which the diplomats put forward to the administrations of the host countries. So this is the art of persuasion. Then there is reward, is another means through which diplomacy is carried forward, and it is, if you agree to our demands, we will reward you in such and such manner. All right. So take the example of, again, Pakistan and the United States of America. On the one hand, the United States of America asks Pakistan to do this and that, and then Pakistan will be assisted, economically assisted. And on the other hand, since it is an era of interdependence, so the United States of America is dependent on Pakistan for the settlement of the Afghan dispute, because its troops are stuck over there. So Pakistan can also ask the United States of America that I will reward you with the with the resolution of the Afghan dispute, which is if it is in the power of Pakistani establishment. So Pakistan can ask the United States of America that they would be given this concession, or at least Pakistan would try its best to make sure that the troops are pulled out from Afghanistan, the US troops are pulled out from Afghanistan safe and secure. But you need to give us concessions like, debt servicing to Pakistan from the IMF. Then you need to put us in the white list of the FATF, and so on and so forth. So it was just an example which came to my mind, and I thought to share it with you. So this reward is there, and it is a means of diplomacy, and every country can use it, this means of diplomacy, to carry forward their agenda, or carry forward their diplomacy, or pursue their national interest, or the goals of the national interest. Then another means is the promise of reward and the concessions. So again, it is the same thing, that you promise something, you promise a country, the diplomats promise a country that these are our national interests, these are the just national interests of this country, and if you do not try to become an obstacle in the achievement of these interests for my country, then I will definitely talk to my government, and my government, I am authorized on behalf of my government, I assure you that you will be rewarded in this manner, and you will be given such and such concessions. So it is there, and this promise of reward and concession is used as a means to achieve the objective, for the achievement of the objective. Then the threat of use of force is there. Okay, I have tried to persuade you. The diplomat might think that, okay, I have tried to persuade this country, the political administration of this country, it did not agree to my persuasion. Then I tried to present them with a carrot, but it did not take that carrot, right? Like reward and concessions, it did not even consider those offers of reward and concessions from me. So now is the time to threat them with the use of force. So then diplomats, even afterwards, they threat someone with the use of force, that okay, you see, these are my objectives, I need to achieve them. But if you are not willing to be persuaded, if you are not enticed by my offers of reward and concessions, then the last resort with me is that I will communicate to my home country, and my home country will, it is determined to punish you, because it needs to achieve these objectives, and you might be punished in several forms. So this is another means. Then the non-violent punishment is there. Use of force is one thing, but the non-violent violent punishment is also there, and that is you can deprive a country from your promised rewards and concessions. Okay, this is the non-violent punishment. I had promised you that I would give you let's say economic or military aid, but now I am not giving you this economic and military aid because you did not fulfill such and such promises of yours, or you did not take such steps which could be fruitful or vital for the achievement of my country's interest, right? So these non-violent means of punishment are there, and you can see the example of these non-violent means of punishment in case of Pakistan and US relations, that the United States of America does not directly use force against Pakistan, but it puts Pakistan's economic or military aid on halt, and that is a non-violent use of punishment, which usually Pakistan receives from the United States of America. Then the use of pressure is again another thing, and this is a tactics that diplomats use pressure in order to achieve their goals, in order to achieve their objectives in the host countries. And how these are done, like pressures are exerted on the country. It is, they might resort to the tools of propaganda. Then they might exploit their cultural links, utilize their cultural links in the host country, and people working for them in the host country, like the local people working for the diplomats or diplomatic missions of the foreign countries or the parent countries. Then these local people would exert their pressure on the administration of the host country to give concessions to the demands, or to give concessions to the diplomats of such and such countries, and agree to their demands so that they can achieve their objectives. Then they can exploit the local situation, the fault lines in the local in the host country. These diplomats, they can exploit these fault lines, and there are so many other things, but all these channels are utilized to exert pressure on the host countries. Then what is the function or the role of diplomacy? So there are some of the major functions of diplomacy, that is the ceremonial or the symbolic functions. So number one, this ceremonial and symbolic function of diplomacy is that they represent their state and government in all official ceremonies in the host country. You need to keep it in mind, in the host countries, and function as well as in non-official social and cultural functions held in place of their posting. So whenever there is a function in the host country, the diplomats would be invited, official functions, the diplomats would be invited to those functions. Even to some non-official functions, these diplomats are invited. So and they are invited, like you cannot invite the president or the prime minister of a country all the time to your country to attend your functions, but their representatives are there in your country, and then you invite these ambassadors, or at times if the level of the function is not that much high, then you invite their first secretary, second secretary, and the lower ranking diplomats to your functions, but still that representation is there as they represent their own countries. Again, number second function is, again, that is representation. So that the diplomats, they represent their countries, and they are the agent of communication between the home office and the host country. They are agent of communication because they represent the country. So if you need to communicate something to a country, if a country A wants to communicate something to country B, the best channel, the only available channel with them is the diplomatic channel. They would go about it via diplomatic means through the embassies established in these countries. Right? And this representation is legal and political in nature. It is not something which you can term that this is illegal. It is legal and political in nature. This representation is usually done. Then another function is that and one more thing about this representation, that the diplomat can even vote on behalf of his government, and we can see this in the United Nations, in the sessions in the United Nations, that the diplomats over there, it is not the president of the US vetoing something. It is not the Prime Minister of Pakistan presenting a resolution. It is the diplomat, the envoy of Pakistan over there, the envoy of US and the envoy of other countries who do all these things on behalf of their government. So they have this right to vote on behalf of his or her government. The diplomats have got this right to vote. Another function is that a negotiation, which is a substantive function of diplomacy. You need to keep it in mind that negotiations is one of the primary functions of diplomacy. Some of the philosophers or some of the thinkers like Palmer and Perkins, they call that diplomats are by definitions negotiators, right? So this is the core function of diplomacy. They are the channel of communication which handle the transmission of messages between the foreign ministries of the parent state and that of the host state. So these are these formal channels of communication. The role of diplomacy in conducting negotiations has, however, declined in our times because of the emergence of multilateral diplomacy, right? Then personal diplomacy is also there, and then summit diplomacy is also there. So now there are different forms of diplomacy. So that is why this one-to-one negotiations, this role has been minimized, but it is still, even if you talk about this multilateral diplomacy, the personal diplomacy, the political diplomacy, the summit diplomacy, all of these are forms of diplomacy and negotiations are held over there. But the role of a diplomat stationed in another country and negotiate on behalf of his state with the host state, that has been minimized due to all these things which are now available in this modern era, which I have mentioned. And then obviously the direct communications or the direct communications links between the heads of the state or the heads of the government between different states. So that has also minimized the role of the diplomat in the process of negotiations, but it does not mean that his role has been eliminated or excluded altogether. It does not mean that. Then reporting is another very important function of diplomacy. So reporting is also very important, and it is all these things. Reporting involves the observation of the political, economic, military and social conditions of the host countries and the accurate transmission of the findings of the diplomat to his home country. Now this reporting is of various kind. Number one, that is, you can call it the political reporting, because political reporting is one form of it, and these reports are sent to the parent country by the diplomats in the host countries on a regular basis. I think usually on a fortnightly basis. All right. So this is the frequency of reports in most of the cases. Political reporting, it involves a report about the assessment of the political condition or the political parties in the host country, and the home country or the parent country is apprised about all the political situation and the condition of the political parties and their differences and their commonalities by the diplomats and their home countries, or their home countries. They keep a record of that assessment. So this data is then utilized in times of needs, and they would know that which party is supposed to be contacted in which kind of situation. This is what usually happens. And then economic reporting is another thing which involves general information about the economic health and the trade potential of the host country. So this economic reporting is done by the economic section of the embassies stationed in a country. Then military reporting is the assessment of the military might of the host country and their intentions and their capabilities, and this is done by the military attaché stationed in the diplomatic missions in different countries, and they report these things to their host countries. And all these reports, they present a comprehensive picture of the host country about the level of social harmony and the level of cohesion. All these things, they are determined and they are assessed by the parent country or by the home country through these reports which the diplomats send their home countries from the host country. So all these things are assessed by it. And then diplomats, they usually change or they usually try to prevent any sort of action which they think can be somehow detrimental to the interests or the goals or the stated goals or the national interest of their home country. So these are some of the functions of diplomacy or the diplomats which are being done these days. I think that we would stop this lecture over here. There are some other aspects of it, and I will discuss those aspects of the present topic in my next video for your next class. If you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, subscribe, press the bell icon, select the all notifications so that you get regular notifications in your YouTube inbox whenever I upload a new video. Thank you very much for watching. Take care. Allah Hafiz.